I was the kid who could debate philosophy for hours and who could understand psychology better than all of my professors, who could see exactly what elite athletes needed in order to perform better. But I couldn't ask a girl out. I couldn't pick one business to focus on. I was even working 5 different jobs at one point, getting absolutely nowhere. So here's the story of how being too smart actually almost destroyed my life, and how I finally figured out how to get the fuck out of my own way. Look, I know what you're probably thinking. Look, here's another entrepreneur with his self-aggrandizing rags to riches story. This definitely is not that. This is more so about something that's been way more fundamental for me. This is about what happens when your biggest strengths become your absolute biggest weaknesses. But also, you'll hear in the end how my biggest weaknesses have actually become my biggest strengths. So if you've ever felt like you're just too smart for your own good, if you've ever been paralyzed by having too many good options, if you've ever been told you're overthinking everything, then this story is for you. Because I'm going to tell you exactly how I went from being that person to now helping entrepreneurs making $500,000 a month, or who are about to shut their business down, to within 3 months being able to make $50K a month with 3 hours a day. So let me take you all the way back to the beginning. Super early on growing up as a kid, I was the confident, goofy, silly, fearless kid that would do anything. I was a troublemaker, but in the best way. I wasn't self-conscious at all. I was flirty, I was noisy, and I put myself out there without thinking twice. Since preschool, I was also that kid whose favorite word was why. I loved to argue, not because I was being difficult, but because I enjoyed the intellectual stimulation. I'd be able to create Socratic debates about completely random topics that certainly weren't worth the energy. My family, of course, would always lift me up and tell me how smart I was and that I was going places. My teachers loved me, or at least it was more of a love-hate relationship, because I asked the hard questions and I was willing to challenge them. And I guess you could say I was that kid who was just a bit too mature for their own age. I was always friends with people older than me. I got separated in summer camp to the older group. I'm sure you know the type. But somewhere around the end of middle school into high school, everything began to change. As my friends and I were getting older, kids would start experimenting with drugs and alcohol, but I had made a very clear decision. I was not doing any of that. And for me at that time, it wasn't even discipline, it was my identity. I took pride in not drinking, smoking, partying. Around that same time, I was growing taller, going through puberty, and always being the tall kid, I actually became pretty self-conscious of my body. I was that kid who was never comfortable taking their shirt off at the pool. You know, as long as I can remember, I've never felt comfortable doing that. But where things really began to get interesting, I started to hear feedback from people that would stick with me for years. My friends would say, "Jesse, you always want to be right." Yeah, of course, you're always right. And they weren't wrong. I was exhausting to be around because I would turn every conversation into a philosophical debate. And not necessarily because I was trying to prove that I was smarter than everyone, but because I genuinely enjoyed it. But to them, it felt like I was just always trying to win. And yes, some of that might stem from some level of insecurity. So now I'm this tall, self-conscious kid who doesn't drink, doesn't party, and turns every conversation into a debate. You can probably guess what happens next. I started getting excluded from my lifelong friend group. Maybe they thought I was judging them for drinking, or that I might tell their parents. They thought I was being too uptight, too serious, too argumentative. And honestly, they probably weren't wrong about some of that. But around this time is when everything began to really compound. And I went from that confident, goofy, flirty kid who wasn't afraid of anything to being constantly in my own head, completely self-conscious, and lacking any and all real confidence. I never talked to girls all throughout high school. I couldn't put myself out there because I was constantly worried about saying the right thing, being judged, being rejected. So now what did that do? Where did that lead me? Well, I became incredibly introspective, and I started analyzing every interaction, every conversation, every social cue. I was able to very clearly read when my friends were frustrated with me, and I could tell when they didn't want me around. I honestly kind of became this emotional intelligence machine. I couldn't use any of that insight to actually improve my situation. And it also kind of perpetuated the cycle of being too self-aware. I was stuck in this weird middle ground where I was mentally maturing faster than a lot of my peers in some ways, but in other ways, I was completely stunted. I deeply understood psychology and human behavior, but I couldn't apply it in my own life. And this was really the turning point where the pattern started that would really follow me into the next decade. I became addicted to seeking external validation and the opinion of others for every decision that I made. I couldn't even trust my own judgment because I'd been told so many times, you're always trying to be right, that I started to wonder, well, what if I'm wrong? Fast forward towards the end of high school, I'm pursuing basketball because I'm one of the tallest kids in the school. And especially being at a very competitive high school, I was certainly never the most talented player. And because of that, I was also never fully committed to developing my craft. But that was because I already knew what I really loved: psychology. And I had a teammate who transferred to our school and became one of my closer friends. And I talked about this a little bit more in detail on a previous podcast video that you can check out. I'll leave the link below. But I began helping him understand what it was like to transition his mindset into being able to perform at a high level within our program. That experience of seeing someone transform their performance through their mindset, like, that was it for me. So also from my uncle and growing up partly a Steelers fan, I always knew I wanted to go to Pittsburgh. And so that's what I did. I got admitted to the University of Pittsburgh knowing that I was going to study psychology, and I also had the opportunity to become a student manager in a Division I basketball program. So here I got to collide my two worlds even further, studying performance and organizational psychology while working with an elite program full of some of the best players and coaches in the country. I was spending 12 to 14-hour days in the gym sometimes. I was completely committed to the program while studying how elite athletes and coaches operate. And we went through 3 different coaching staffs while I was there, which gave me incredible insight into different leadership styles, and especially as I was pursuing certificates in leadership development as well. I got to see how one coach could connect with a player in a way that the next coach definitely didn't. I was studying human performance at the highest level, and not even just in my classes. But here's the thing, even though I was surrounded by all this elite performance, I still couldn't apply it to my personal life. I still lacked confidence. I was still seeking everyone else's validation for every decision that I made. Now, I thought after graduation I would go down the typical route of getting my master's, getting my doctorate, becoming a sports psychologist. I had the entire plan mapped out in my mind. But things really didn't work out as I originally thought. Now, I'm certainly grateful that the path didn't turn out to be that way, and that I ended up not pursuing further education, but rather pursuing further experiences. I actually bounced over to Australia. I was there for about a month and a half, where I traveled mostly alone and got the opportunity to start to try and reinvent myself in a lot of ways. And through some of those experiences, I got a bit of a taste of what was possible, and realizing that I had the choice to be whoever I wanted to be. But then I came back home and I kind of fell back into the same patterns. For a handful of months after the summer, I was working for my family's business with no pay, just living at home, feeling completely lost. I had nothing lined up for my master's and not really any clear direction. So I did what any confused psychology major would probably do. I went and I worked at Starbucks. No, I'm just kidding. What that ended up turning into is me building a basketball training business in Philadelphia while supporting my family business living at home. But I still felt that I wasn't the fullest version of myself. And one of the big leaps that I took to develop some confidence was go and get a retail job. And this is when things started to really get a bit crazy for me. Throughout the next 6 months or so over that time, I was running my basketball training sessions, I was working for my family business, I was managing a bunch of real estate properties, and I was also scrounging together a bunch of shit that I could sell on eBay. I was busy as hell, but I wasn't building anything. And I obviously couldn't possibly execute any of those in the way that I needed to. Now, I will say that that retail job was actually pivotal for me because I felt that the only way that I can actually break out of my outdated identity was to force myself to have to interact with people, put myself out there, and get comfortable being me again. I got to the point where I was making really decent money in my basketball training business, but I was scattered in every direction. And then to top it all off, COVID hit in March of 2020. So my training sessions plummeted. I had to scramble to find out ways to keep that alive. Part of that turned into coaching some college athletes and other athletes online. But I couldn't have even gone out and been social even if I wanted to because I was taking care of some family and I couldn't risk exposing them. So now I'm completely isolated, working all these different jobs, trying to help out my family however I could, and I'm even more dependent on external validation than ever, making sure that I was doing everything to support them. I couldn't make many decisions without feeling like I should ask my family, my mom, or anyone else I was the guy who understood psychology better than maybe even my therapist and did his job for him, who could help elite athletes truly perform at their best, who could read people like a book, but I couldn't trust my own judgment about anything. Throughout a portion of this time leading up to 2023, we got hit with basically a 100-year flood that wiped out our rental properties, where I spent months in solitude ripping out drywall, laying floors, you name it, wondering what the fuck am I doing with my time, knowing that I was destined for something more, but I couldn't execute to actually get there. So by 2023, I knew I had to do something drastic. My best friend had moved to Miami, so I began visiting him, and through being here and having conversations with those around me, I knew that I was too comfortable and I needed to shake things up. So I visited one final time in July of 2023, and I pulled the trigger and signed a lease within a month and moved down here in September, and I made the leap. Now, moving to Miami, I needed to cut almost probably 90% of my income, and at the same time, my expenses basically increased by 1,000%. I went from making good money with minimal expenses to basically making nothing in Miami of all places. But the thing about that is, what happens is when you can't afford to overthink anymore, you stop overthinking. Within the first few months in Miami, I was able to bring on a lot more coaching clients, and not just basketball training. I was doing a lot more mental performance coaching with college athletes, with business owners, working with entrepreneurs who were making way more money than me, but were quite honestly just a bit miserable and stuck. I had this one client who was ready to shut his business down, and within 3 months, he's doing $50K a month, working 3 to 5 hours a day, traveling whenever he decides, and had another client who was making $500,000 a month on TikTok Shop, while still driving his own delivery trucks to get packages out the door because he couldn't get out of his own way. That led him to being burnt out, miserable, unclear on why he was doing it all in the first place. And through all that, I actually realized something a bit profound, which is my overthinking wasn't necessarily a flaw, it was actually a feature. Because when you've spent years analyzing why you can't get out of your own way, you become really good at helping other people get out of theirs. Here's the uncomfortable truth that no one wants to admit. It doesn't matter how smart you are, how skilled you are, or how much you know if you can't build the internal trust to act quickly and execute. Every decision you need to make, you already know the answer to. The problem isn't that you need more information. The problem is that you don't trust yourself enough to act on what you already know. I spent years asking everyone else what I should do because I was afraid of being wrong. But being wrong isn't the problem. Not making a decision in the first place is the biggest problem. And that's when I began to understand the importance of what I now call the execution gap. And that is the gap between deciding and doing. The gap between knowing exactly what needs to be done and actually executing on it. The most successful entrepreneurs are not the smartest people in the room. And if absolutely nothing else, the time that I've been here in Miami has made me realize that the most successful entrepreneurs are actually dumb as fuck. And what that means is that they don't have the intellectual capacity to overthink themselves into paralysis. And that leaves them able to be the ones who can make decisions quickly, but they're also able to adjust based on feedback. And that momentum, that action, is what takes them further than anyone else. But none of this is about becoming someone that you're not. It's about understanding who you actually are and realizing that identity without all of the burnout and the mental friction. And that's what I call closing the alignment gap, which is the misalignment between your identity and your goals. So if you're watching this and you recognize yourself in any part of my story, if you're the smart person who can't execute, or if you're tired of being paralyzed by having too many options, if you finally want to stop seeking everyone else's validation and start trusting your own judgment, hopefully this is exactly where you need to be and you consider hitting that subscribe button. The world doesn't need another person who has all the right answers. It needs the people who can take action on what they do know and make a difference. Feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at Jesse H. Hoffman. I'm always available in the DMs. But before you leave, I want you to drop a comment below and tell me, what's one decision that you've been overthinking that you already know the answer to? I'll read every single comment. I'd love to hear your story and what you're facing. And go ahead and watch this next video for a deeper breakdown on my performance freedom engine, which will tell you everything you need to know to finally get unstuck and building towards your freedom. I hope this has been valuable. Talk to you soon. Peace.